Plugged In podcast, a new project from the Institute for Energy Research. To find out more about our work, visit our website at instituteforenergyresearch.org.
Welcome to the Plugged In podcast. I'm Alex Stevens, a policy analyst at the Institute for Energy Research. This week, the Trump administration announced that it was planning to roll back the corporate average fuel economy mandates and revoke the waiver that allowed California to set its own emission mandates for cars and trucks. The current CAFE mandates require that car makers reach a fleet average of 54.5 miles per gallon by 2025. After the rule change, their new goal would be around 37 miles per gallon. U.S. automakers have kept quiet about the rule change, but environmental groups are already bemoaning the damages they believe increased emissions will cause. Joining me today to discuss this topic are my colleagues Jordan McGillis, who is a policy analyst here at IER, and our Director of Policy, Kenny Stein. Guys, thank you for joining me today.
All right, let's do it.
Nowhere else I'd rather be, Alex.
Why don't we start with Kenny? Can you give us some background on the CAFE standards, and then just what is the Department of Transportation's justification for wanting to roll back these rules?
Yeah, so this is a very significant decision that they've decided to take. The Department of Transportation is basically taking back control over the CAFE program. Under the Obama administration, the CAFE, because of the way that greenhouse gas regulations and fuel economy interact, the Department of Transportation and EPA were, supposedly worked together to come up with these standards. And now it appears that the Department of Transportation is firmly stepping back in and saying, hey, you know what? We're actually the lead agency here. We want to be in control.
What do you guys think about this? It's I think this is a little bit more of an aggressive move than we were expecting out of the Transportation Department, right?
Well, yeah, I don't know.
That's not to say it couldn't be better, but...
Yeah, right. Well, it's fairly aggressive. What's actually interesting is that I was surprised that Department of Transportation actually won the fight over EPA. Because EPA's been, taken over control of all this for a long time. So I was actually a little surprised that Department of Transportation seems to be in control in the driver's seat. And
it's interesting from our perspective because historically speaking, it does make sense that DOT would take the reins here, but at the same time, the whole CAFE program is ridiculous, and we don't really want DOT to be in charge of that either.
Yeah, well, obviously, the CAFE program itself, it's a relic of the 70s. Like, it's when we were supposedly running out of oil. Like, there's no reason for it anymore. But if we're going to have it, it's a transportation policy, so it really should be run by the Department of Transportation. And frankly, the law itself says transportation is the number one agency. So it's right and proper that transportation should be in charge. But the really interesting thing for me was how that they are going after California's special ability to run the program. Essentially, CARB was handed to control the program under the Obama administration.
Give our listeners a little more on that. What was the interaction between the federal government and California that, in your perspective, put California in charge of this to a degree?
Yeah, well, literally, the way the Obama administration did it was the Obama EPA, Department of Transportation, and the California Air Resources Board. Like, those are the three agencies in the room that dictated these standards that they came out with. So it's literally, and I don't know if you guys have probably seen the quote, but it was in the New York Times, but they actually bragged that they didn't put anything in writing at these meetings. Like, they were doing it in secret to impose on the rest of the country.
If only that new New York Times columnist would have done the same.
Yeah.
About 40% of the U.S. auto market gears the products that they're building towards California's standards. So obviously, their ability to sort of set that for the entire country back is going to be a really big deal.
Oh yeah, it makes a big difference. And also the other thing is that this really isn't truly a rollback. So a lot of people are trying to call it a rollback. It's really a freeze. Like the standards are going to keep rising till 2021, and then they stop for the model years after that. So it's limiting the damage, I guess, from the previous standards. It's not really they're not really rolling them back. Sure. So
why not let California go its own way on this? What makes that unfeasible or illegal?
Well, the reason that the Department of Transportation says it's illegal because the CAFE law says that no state may make any regulation relating to fuel economy, related to governing fuel economy or related to fuel economy.
And they have a mandate that pertains to clean air, right? Or sorry, they have the waiver.
The waiver that California has had for a long time is in the Clean Air Act, which is completely separate from the CAFE law. And under the Clean Air Act, they can regulate other pollutants. But this is what's going to have to be litigated, frankly, by the Supreme Court, is that the Department of Transportation and EPA under the Trump administration are now saying that greenhouse gases, specifically from the tailpipe, are so indistinguishable from fuel economy. Literally, the way you reduce CO2 emissions from the tailpipe is you use less fuel. Like it's almost 1 for 1. Therefore, they are the same. They qualify under related to, and there can't be state level regulations on it. And that's never been litigated, so we don't actually know how that'll ultimately come out.
I'm actually interested to hear what you guys think about that. Do you guys think that federalism should apply to regulation, basically, that creating competing regulatory environments will be better off for what we're trying to accomplish?
Yeah, that's a tough one because there's a reason interstate commerce is written into the Constitution. You can't be impeding trade across state lines. However, I honestly, ideologically, I think it's perfectly right and proper that if a state wants to have tougher, environmental regulations, they should have that option to do that. So I think the key is here, you have cars travel across state lines, and obviously the auto dealers want one national standard. So where do you draw that line? I'm not sure. However, that's our philosophical discussion.
Right. Yeah.
But the legal discussion is that Congress already drew that distinction.
Right,
and they said for fuel economy, there's no state role at all. So
I think the philosophical discussion is the much more interesting one, but it's not easy to parse that out. I think my general inclination is to leave these sorts of things to the states as much as possible, provided that there isn't a gross disregard for the rights of the citizens within those states in terms of the Constitution, things like that.
Well, what about the rights of the citizens of other states?
Right.
California doesn't make the cars. Michigan makes the cars. So if California is forcing regulations on car companies in Michigan, how do you deal with that?
That doesn't necessarily prevent a company from being started that only builds cars that are geared towards the rules in California, I guess. But
Tesla.
I agree with Alex there. I'm not particularly moved by what you're saying there, Kenny, about consumers in other states being controlled by Californians. It's the companies in this theoretical. If we just eliminate the laws here, we just talk about theory. If one state has regulations on which cars can be sold in that state, it's up to the automakers to decide what cars they're going to make, where they're going to sell them. So there is, and even in the context of the existing laws, some of the onus is on the automakers, is it not?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, and that's why I know the automakers make the one national standard argument. It's not as persuasive to me, honestly, because they already, you sell cars with a cold weather package, 4-wheel drive. There's all sorts of different features that they sell in different parts of the country. So, the one national standard probably makes their lives easier, but I'm not sure it's required by the Constitution.
Yeah. One more point on automakers. The negotiations with the Obama administration and the California Air Regulations Board, those took place in the aftermath of what?
Right. This was happening in 2009 when the government owned Chrysler and GM, frankly. Literally owned them. And Ford, managed to technically stay independent, but they were also kind of independent. Sure. And certainly their part suppliers were dependent on government support and that kind of stuff.
Absolutely, and it's embedded in a history of that sort of things. Obviously, Chrysler bailouts in the 70s, too, so it's not like...
Right.
It wasn't a new thing.
But what
it was a long relationship between that industry and... and
what was new about it, though, is just the timing. They were in no position to argue because literally the government was telling them what to do. So it's sort of, there's some people that have described it like they were, they're like hostages of the government at this point. And so they're just so terrified of the government coming after them or beating them more that they just want them to stop. So, yeah, and I understand the auto dealers, or not the auto dealers, the auto manufacturers. I understand where they're coming from, but what's easiest for their business isn't necessarily the
What's
best
best for
policy.
everyone.
Yeah, what's best for the American people or best for the consumer. Yeah.
And now the dealers, they have a completely different set of interests, right? They tend to be strongly opposed to these strict
Right.
fuel mandates because it depresses sales.
Right. That's what's so interesting is that the dealers are actually at odds with the manufacturers on this. Because, yeah, like you said, they think that partly because CAFE, it does raise the price of new vehicles. And if vehicles are more expensive, people keep their old cars longer. So the dealers would prefer people to be buying a new car every 5 years or so instead of holding on to a car, 10, 15 years. So, yeah, the dealers have actually consistently been on the other side of the manufacturers on this stuff, which is very interesting. That's part of what cleaves, this whole discussion cleaves things a little differently.
It's interesting too because obviously the dealers are the people in the whole process who are closest to the customer, and this freeze in increasing the mandates is obviously great for consumers.
Right. Yeah. Well, and the dealers also understand that people want to buy SUVs. They want big cars.
Right.
It's, the government can demand that you buy electric cars, but if people don't want to buy them, they're not going to buy them.
Well, and the most ridiculous argument that you hear made in favor of stricter mandates on fuel economy is that this is going to save people at the pump. That argument is ridiculous. People can choose to buy a more efficient vehicle if we're given that liberty in the market.
Exactly.
There is going to be a market for fuel efficient vehicles. There's going to be a market for larger vehicles that are less fuel efficient. And to say that these regulations are going to give us savings at the pump is just ludicrous.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And if you want an electric vehicle, if you don't want to pay for gas, you can get an electric vehicle. When we freeze the CAFE standards, it doesn't mean you can't get electric vehicles anymore. It just means that you'll be able to get a car that's not the price isn't artificially inflated by this regulation.
You mentioned briefly the electric vehicle issue in California that's potentially a little hang up. What's going on with that?
Well, that's what's very interesting about it, and it's the one part of the regulation that I'm the least certain about is that the Department of Transportation takes their preemption argument all the way to preempting California's zero emission vehicle program, which is basically trying to force the elimination of the combustion engine, frankly. But they are trying to push electric vehicles on everyone, and they hand out lots of subsidies and credits to try and force this. And Department of Transportation is saying that, you know what, that program is a fuel economy program, and therefore is preempted by the CAFE standards law.
Well, and then that gives credence to this federal government overreach argument that we're going to hear when they do take that additional step that may not have been necessary to make great strides.
Right. That's the one place I think is a little bit tenuous. The one thing is that the California government did say when they did their zero emission vehicles, they literally said, this is not about emissions. This is about, they literally said that, even though they're now trying to say it's about pollution. So they've got them on record doing that, but their intent isn't necessarily what matters in court. It's the legal text. It's like it becomes a textual discussion. So I'm not sure where that one's going to go. I think they've got a better case on the Clean Air Act waiver side of it, preempting that. But that's going to end up in the Supreme Court a few years from now, and we'll see.
Built into a lot of these conversations is just sort of the assumption that any decrease in emissions is good, no matter what the cost. And certainly, the way that cafes talked about, I feel like a lot of people just sort of take it for granted
assume
that
that's good. Yeah,
we're seeing emissions reductions. Why is that wrong? I guess.
Well, there's always the question of diminishing returns. 40 years ago, this applies to a lot of regulations, not just environmental. It's everything. Like initially, when the river's lighting on fire because it's so polluted, yeah, almost any decrease in that is good. But at some point, you can't eliminate. You're never going to have perfectly pristine, clean air. There's a question. It's just you've got to get to a point where it's safe. I mean, there's a difference between clean and safe.
Another point I would add there is even if your priority is the reduction of emissions, whether those be greenhouse gas emissions or otherwise, this approach of putting a mandate on the automakers is not the most efficient way to go about it. You can do that in a lot of different ways. the most logical way that you hear from economists that are tend to be on the right is the Pigovian style tax on emissions rather than this mandate on what you can produce and sell.
Yeah. Well, and that's the other thing is that, instead of a CAFE, if the goal is to reduce fuel consumption, then increase gas tax. Well, why are we doing this mandate on the manufacturers? And of course, the reason is that it's unpopular to raise the gas tax because that can be directly traced back to the politicians, whereas the costs of the CAFE mandates are much more hidden, much harder to calculate. And so it's obviously intentional.
We have any figures here on what those costs are for the average car buyer?
I saw Heritage release a study. I think it's a couple years old, but they were looking at the increase of costs leading up to 2016. It was going to be like $3,600 a car, I think.
Right. Was it the Kreutzer-Firth study?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then to 25, I think it was another $3,000.
Yeah, and
more that you're paying into
and
buying a new car.
And the regulation that just came out, the Department of Transportation, I think calculated is like $2,350 per car will be saved or something by freezing. So, but here's the thing: is it's hard to calculate, and that's intentional. They want to hide those costs. They don't want them to be on the sticker that you're buying. They don't want you to know the cost of the regulation.
Does anyone trot out the old national security or fuel security argument nowadays, or has that completely fallen out of the dialogue now that we are such a large producer of oil?
Yeah, I haven't heard that much of that so far. Obviously, this is still early days in this debate, but I think a lot of that has fallen off. Sometimes you still hear the RFS discussions on
right,
separate, but the biofuel guys say that a lot.
Right.
I haven't heard that yet on that much on the electric car.
And in the late 70s, when this emerged, it was in the aftermath of really a government manufactured fuel crisis, and then it was this CAFE policy was then re-upped in the 2000s when the price of gasoline was really high, price of oil was really high. In those late Bush years. Yeah.
So but that has been the justification for a long time was national security. But of course, the last 10 plus years, we've had the shale boom, domestic production boom, and that's not a persuasive argument yet anymore for anyone who knows what's happened with U.S. energy. And I think that's part of why that has not yet been a big talking point, and I'm not sure it will be.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's about all the time we have. Kenny, I'm going to give you the last word on this, though. What else should our listeners be looking at when it comes to these CAFE mandates?
Yeah, so this is the beginning of the process. This is the starting gun. It's what is called an advanced notice of proposed rulemaking, which is the first stage of the regulatory process. So there's going to be a proposed rule coming up. After that, there's going to be the final rule. Then there'll be litigation. There'll be comment periods at every stage as the rule evolves. So there'll be lots of opportunities for us at IER to get involved and individuals to comment at every stage of this, to weigh in and explain why they don't want their cars to be more expensive to subsidize Californians.
Great, thank you. Thank you for listening to the Plugged In podcast. Please rate and review us on iTunes, and to learn more about our work, visit instituteforenergyresearch.org.